On April 29, 1945, American soldiers entered Dachau concentration camp. They had fought across North Africa, through Italy, across the beaches of Normandy. These were not young men who had never seen death. What they found inside those gates stopped them completely. Train cars packed with bodies, barracks filled with the dying, and SS guards, the men responsible for all of it, attempting to blend in with other prisoners, hoping no one would look too closely. Some of those guards never made it to a prison cell, and when the full story of what the SS had done across 6 years and an entire continent became clear, the villages burned, the mass graves, the industrial killing, the question historians still debate is not why some captured SS soldiers were shot on sight. The question is why anyone is surprised that it happened. This is the story of what the SS built, what they did, and what happened to them when the world they created collapsed around them. If you believe history's darkest chapters must be told completely and honestly, subscribe to Timelines of War right now and turn on notifications. Every event in this video actually happened, every location was real, and understanding what drove ordinary soldiers to shoot captured enemies requires understanding everything that came before that moment. Let's start from the beginning. To understand what happened to captured SS soldiers in 1945, you have to understand what the SS actually was, not as a symbol or a historical label, but as an institution built deliberately and systematically over more than 2 decades. It began small, almost laughably so, in 1925. A tiny guard unit formed around Adolf Hitler. A handful of loyal men whose primary function was personal protection. Emil Maurice, Julius Schreck. A few others. They drove cars, they stood at doors. They looked more like bouncers than soldiers. What transformed this small group into something the world had never seen before was Heinrich Himmler. When Himmler took control of the SS in 1929, he had a vision that went far beyond personal protection. He wanted to build an organization that could reshape Germany from within, a force defined not just by physical capability, but by ideological commitment so complete that conventional moral reasoning simply ceased to operate. By 1933, the SS had grown to more than 52,000 members. It no longer resembled anything that had existed 8 years earlier. Himmler encouraged every SS member to understand themselves as elite, racially superior, ideologically pure, operating at a level above ordinary Germans and infinitely above the people they would eventually be ordered to destroy. Their training schools, at Bad Thiels and Braunschweig, didn't just teach combat skills. They systematically dismantled empathy and replaced it with absolute loyalty to a single man. Recruits practiced scenes involving raiding homes, clearing villages, forcing civilians to kneel at gunpoint. The explicit goal of the training was to produce men who could carry out what their commanders called difficult tasks without hesitation, because hesitation was treated as weakness, and weakness was treated as failure. The result was not a military organization in any conventional sense. It was something more specific and more dangerous, a force trained to execute decisions that no ordinary soldier could be relied upon to carry out. And when war came, that is exactly what they were used for. September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Most of the world focused on the military campaign, the tanks, the air strikes, the speed of the German advance. What followed behind the front lines received far less attention, and that was entirely by design. SS units designated for what their orders called special actions moved into Polish cities within days of the military advance. Einsatzgruppe IV under Joseph Albert Meisinger moved through Warsaw, Radom, Poznań, and Kielce carrying lists, actual written lists, of people marked for immediate execution. Intellectuals, politicians, priests, teachers, anyone the regime had identified as capable of organizing Polish resistance. Within 3 weeks of the invasion beginning, these units had killed more than 20,000 civilians. Not in battles, not in crossfire, in courtyards, in fields, in basements, with pointed guns and pre-prepared lists. This was not improvised, it was planned, written down, and tracked with the same administrative precision the German bureaucracy applied to everything else. SS units had assigned roles. Some gathered victims, some stood in firing lines, some cataloged the bodies afterward. The scale was staggering, the documentation was meticulous, and the outside world knew almost nothing about it. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, what the SS had done in Poland, horrifying as it was, became a prelude. 4 Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed the advancing German army into Soviet territory. Each one was assigned a specific geographic area. Each one had specific targets. And each one operated with an explicit understanding from the highest levels of the Nazi regime that civilian populations in the occupied East were not to be treated as human beings deserving of any protection. Einsatzgruppe A under Franz Stahlecker, swept through the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, leaving mass graves from Kaunas to Riga. By early 1942, this single unit had killed more than 249,000 people. Einsatzgruppe under Arthur Neby moved through Belarus, through Grodno, Vitebsk, Mogilev, conducting systematic shootings of Jewish communities and anyone designated as politically threatening. Einsatzgruppe C under Otto Rasch drove through Ukraine, Zhytomyr, Poltava, Dnipropetrovsk. Following the same pattern, the cumulative numbers reached into the hundreds of thousands within months, then into the millions across the full course of the war. These killings followed a repeating methodology. Victims were gathered through announcements that used deliberately misleading language, telling communities they were being relocated or registered or processed for labor assignment. They were walked to forests or ravines outside towns. They were ordered to undress. They were shot in groups and buried in mass graves that were then concealed. The process was documented internally with the same cold bureaucratic precision that characterized every other aspect of German administration. Reports went up the chain of command. Numbers were tracked, efficiency was assessed. In forests outside Minsk, tens of thousands died. In Babi Yar, a ravine outside Kiev, more than 33,000 people were killed in 2 days. In small towns across Lithuania and Latvia, entire Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were eliminated within hours. The Soviet soldiers who later fought their way westward through these regions, who crossed ground covered with mass graves, who liberated towns where entire populations had vanished, carried that knowledge with them. It shaped every decision they made about SS prisoners for the remainder of the war. In Western Europe, the SS operated differently, but the outcomes converged on the same destination. In France, the SS worked alongside the Gestapo to systematically dismantle resistance networks. Raids in Paris in 1942 pulled thousands from their homes in coordinated overnight operations. In Lyon, the SS worked with security commanders to interrogate and eliminate anyone connected to underground networks, methods that left permanent marks on the city's memory. In Denmark and the Netherlands, SS police forces conducted night operations that emptied houses by sunrise, families taken with no warning, no charges, no explanation given to neighbors who watched from their windows. In Italy, after the country switched sides in September 1943, the SS treated Italian civilians as an enemy population. On March 24, 1944, at the Ardeatine Caves outside Rome, 335 civilians were executed within a few hours, selected at random from Rome's streets and prisons as collective punishment for a partisan attack on German troops. In the village of San Anna di Stazzema in Tuscany, SS troops killed 65 civilians, including elderly residents and children. The youngest victim was 20 days old. And then there was Oradour-sur-Glane, June 10, 1944, 4 days after D-Day, as Allied forces were pushing inland from the Normandy beaches. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich arrived in a quiet French village. They separated the men from the women and children. The men were taken to barns and shot. The women and children were locked inside the village church. The church was set on fire. 643 people died in Oradour-sur-Glane that day. The village was left standing afterward exactly as it was, burned out, destroyed, untouched, as a permanent memorial. Because what had been done there was so complete that restoration felt impossible and inappropriate. When Allied soldiers advancing through France learned about Oradour-sur-Glane, and later, when they discovered Malmedy, where 84 American prisoners of war were lined up in a snowy field and shot by SS forces in December 1944, the information traveled through the ranks quickly, completely. It changed things. Behind everything the SS did in the field was a parallel system that dwarfed even the mobile killing units in its scale and organizational sophistication. The concentration camp network began small. Dachau in 1933, built to hold political prisoners, run with the strict discipline that Himmler was establishing as the SS' defining characteristic. But as the SS gained control over Germany's police and security apparatus, the system expanded with terrifying speed. By the war's end, more than 44,000 camps, subcamps, and holding facilities existed across Europe. 44,000. Rudolfers ran Auschwitz, where gas chambers and crematoriums operated on a schedule driven by train timetables. Transports arriving from across occupied Europe, passengers selected on the platform. Those selected for immediate death processed within hours of arrival. Karl Otto Koch at Buchenwald created punishment systems that killed prisoners slowly and with deliberate inefficiency. Starvation, beatings, exposure, designed to extract maximum suffering across extended periods. Joseph Kramer at Bergen, Belsen allowed disease and starvation to accelerate through a camp so overcrowded that the dead lay alongside the living in the same barracks for days. Irma Gray's at Ravensbrück became synonymous with personal cruelty directed at female prisoners, her name remembered specifically by survivors decades later. Treblinka under Irmfried Eberl killed more than 700,000 people in 1942 alone. Sobibor, Chiwimno, Biokik, facilities designed with one operational purpose: to kill as many people as efficiently as possible, run by SS personnel trained to follow orders without any hesitation. Auschwitz alone saw more than 1.1 million deaths. Mauthausen killed at least 90,000 through labor and deliberate brutality. Stuthov claimed around 65,000 lives. When Allied soldiers reached these facilities in the spring of 1945, when they walked through the gates, saw the conditions, found the survivors, opened the records, they weren't just encountering evidence of a historical atrocity, they were standing in the middle of it. Much of it had happened within weeks of their arrival. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing simultaneously on every front. Soviet forces were driving from the east. American, British, and French forces were advancing from the west. German units were fragmenting under pressure that had become impossible to absorb, and the SS, recognizing with increasing clarity what awaited them, began trying to disappear. Thousands of SS members shed their uniforms, tore off their collar insignia, swapped identification with captured Wehrmacht soldiers who hadn't committed the same documented crimes, burned papers, scratched photographs from documents, attempted to dissolve into the massive flows of soldiers and civilians moving through a disintegrating country. But the Allies had anticipated this. For years, Allied intelligence had been collecting names, photographs, fingerprints, and testimony, and one physical detail exposed thousands of SS members almost immediately after surrender: a small tattoo under the left arm, indicating blood type, applied during SS service so that doctors could treat wounded soldiers quickly. This tattoo became one of the most reliable identification tools available to Allied screening teams. In cities across Germany, Hamburg, Bremen, Flensburg, every captured German soldier was checked. Anyone with the tattoo was pulled aside. Many admitted their SS service under questioning. Others maintained false identities even when physical evidence made their claims impossible. A large number fled south into Bavaria and Austria, seeking the mountains and rural areas that offered concealment. American and French patrols searched these routes continuously, and many were captured within days. Outside Germany, the situation for escaping SS members was far more immediate and far more dangerous. In Czechoslovakia, the anger was fresh and specific. Towns across Bohemia and Moravia had suffered brutal SS reprisals in the war's final months. Local resistance fighters established roadblocks and document checks on every significant route. When specific SS units were identified, particularly units like the S-Police Regiment or the Dirlewanger Brigade, whose documented crimes in Eastern Europe were known to local populations, the reaction was immediate. Many captured members did not survive long enough to face any formal proceeding. In Poland, the situation was even more direct. The country had effectively been converted into the primary operational zone for the Nazi extermination program. Survivors from Majdanek, from Auschwitz, from dozens of other facilities were present in the areas where escaping SS members were trying to blend in. They recognized faces, they identified voices, they remembered specific guards. Soviet troops operating in Poland took many of these men into custody. Several were shot in towns across the Silesian region following identification by survivors who provided immediate certain testimony. In Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito's partisan forces had spent years fighting the SS directly, watching entire villages massacred in reprisal operations, losing community after community to collective punishment campaigns. When SS fugitives were identified in May and June 1945 as partisan forces cleared the last German positions, the response reflected everything those fighters had witnessed and experienced across years of occupation. Near Dachau itself, on April 29, 1945, the 45th Infantry Division's reaction when they encountered SS guards attempting to escape or blend in was shaped entirely by what those soldiers were simultaneously discovering around them. Train cars packed with dead prisoners, surviving inmates who weighed barely more than their own bones, the smell and the scale of what had been done in that place. Some guards were shot on the spot. The Malmedy massacre was fresh in every American soldier's memory. The discovery at Dachau made it present and immediate in a completely different way. In the Netherlands, French resistance had captured SS members who had participated in the deportation of Dutch Jewish families. The same operations that had taken parents, siblings, and children from specific people who were now present when these men were found. The gap between formal judicial process and immediate action collapsed in those specific moments. Belgium, France, Denmark, Norway, everywhere the SS had operated, The populations who had experienced that operation directly were present when the SS tried to escape through their territory. Even after Germany's formal surrender on May 8, 1945, a portion of SS members refused to accept that the war was over. The Werwolf, an underground network created by Nazi leadership near the war's end, was intended to sustain German resistance even after military defeat. Its members were primarily young, ideologically committed, and convinced that continued attacks on Allied forces would somehow reverse the outcome of the war. In practice, werewolf groups were small, typically 10 to 20 members, and their operational impact was limited, but their activities created a specific and serious problem for Allied forces trying to establish post-war order. In northern Germany, cells attempted to destroy infrastructure near Oldenburg and Wilhelmshaven. In Austria, a group operating near Linz ambushed American supply convoys. In Czechoslovakia, a cell near Karlovy Vary attempted to establish ambush positions against Soviet patrols. When Allied forces captured werewolf members, they were not treated as surrendered soldiers. They were active combatants who had chosen to continue fighting after their government's formal capitulation. The response was correspondingly direct. This ongoing resistance, even at its relatively small scale, convinced many Allied commanders that certain categories of SS personnel could not be processed through the same procedures as ordinary prisoners of war. The combination of documented wartime atrocities and continued post-war resistance created a security calculation that produced outcomes far removed from the Geneva Convention's provisions. The formal legal response came on October 1, 1946. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg officially declared the SS a criminal organization, a ruling with specific and significant implications. It meant that membership alone, regardless of individual rank or assigned role, constituted participation in an organization whose collective crimes included murder on a scale that had no historical precedent. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who had headed the SS security apparatus after Reinhard Heydrich's assassination in 1942, was convicted and executed. His testimony at Nuremberg attempted to distance himself from operational decisions, a defense the evidence thoroughly contradicted. Subsequent proceedings addressed hundreds of additional defendants: commandants, guards, doctors, administrators, the people who had run the daily operations of a system that had killed millions. But the Nuremberg proceedings, comprehensive as they were, couldn't reach everyone. Thousands of SS members escaped Europe entirely through networks that historians later documented. Rat lines that moved wanted men through sympathetic contacts in neutral countries and ultimately to South America and beyond. Some were identified and prosecuted decades later. Many died having never faced any formal accounting. The SS blood group tattoo that had exposed so many in 1945 led some members to undergo painful procedures to remove or obscure the marking, evidence in its own way of how clearly they understood what that tattoo would mean if they were ever found. The dark reason captured SS soldiers were shot in 1945 was not rage alone. It was information. The soldiers and civilians who pulled triggers in those moments, American infantrymen at Dachau, Polish survivors in Silesia, French resistance fighters, Yugoslav partisans, Soviet soldiers who had crossed fields of mass graves. All of them were acting on specific knowledge about specific things the SS had done. They had seen the train cars. They had found the graves. They had walked through the camps. They had watched their own captured soldiers executed in snowy Belgian fields. They had lost family members and neighbors to midnight raids that emptied houses before dawn. The gap between formal judicial process and immediate action in 1945 was not created by lawlessness. It was created by the scale and specificity of what the SS had built across 6 years and an entire continent, and by the direct, personal, undeniable presence of that evidence in the moment those decisions were being made. The Nuremberg Tribunal ultimately ruled the SS a criminal organization, but for the people who had lived inside the world the SS created, who had survived it, or lost everything to it, the verdict at Nuremberg arrived long after they had already rendered their own. These stories must be told completely, not sanitized, not reduced to comfortable distance. Subscribe to Timelines of War, share this video, because the only way to understand how something like the SS was possible, and how to recognize the conditions that produced it, is to look at what it actually did, without looking away. We are not done telling these stories. Timelines of War. Subscribe, notifications on, share this video.